Hello and welcome to Northern Souls Podcast. I'm your host, Zeke.
And I'm Mike, I'm the co-host.
All right, and our purpose of this podcast will be to discuss, explore, and educate others on Norse heathenry. Ultimately, our goal is to find the good life.
And getting into Norse Heathenry, it's kind of a religious movement. There's a heavy foundation in mythology and the sort of beliefs and systems that are associated with Norse mythology and other forms of Germanic mythology. Um, I figured it'd be good to just do a brief overview of what Norse mythology is, in case there's people listening who don't know much about it. There's a lot of different ways people can become interested in it, so I figured it's good to sort of just highlight some different forms that interests in Norse mythology take. Uh, in the most basic sense, Norse mythology can be described as just a collection of myths from Scandinavia, from the Norse people. Um, Basically a big compilation of related stories and discussions that give an eye into the culture of the Norse people from their era. And, to explain it more in depth than that, it helps to explain how Norse mythology is important to people. And, there's plenty of people who, they'll learn about Norse mythology from pop culture. There's books like Lord of the Rings. There's movies, TV shows, music. Um, and when people learn about Norse mythology from pop culture, they can see it as more of a historical theme or an aesthetic that gets used in pop culture. So, and they probably know there's more to it than that, right? But to them, that's basically all it is. To a lot of people, anyway. And for people who see it that way, it can be important to them, um, but it's certainly important to them in a different way than Norse mythology is important to other people. So, for the sake of offering a more in depth explanation, it's super helpful to take note of the different interests in Norse mythology, and that paints a better picture of how Norse mythology is thought of across the board. So, as I said, it could be an entertainment interest. Um, it can be a historical interest, for people who just enjoy reading and learning about history. There's definitely something to be learned from how ancient peoples led their lives, and tried to shape their futures, and how that relates to the lives we lead today. There's also just a literary interest in Norse mythology for people interested in historical literature. Maybe they read the Odyssey or the Iliad in high school, Maybe they read Beowulf, became interested in stories involving heroes, gods, wars, that sort of thing. There's definitely bits and pieces of Norse mythology to be learned in a epic like Beowulf. There's also just people who enjoy the concept of mythology itself. So they like learning about the theoretical structure of mythic themes and recurring symbolism that gets used throughout a given mythos. So, there's people who enjoy mapping it all out and understanding it as a system. And for those people, Norse mythology might sit alongside Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology in terms of interest. Maybe it's their favorite, maybe it's not. That's just kind of their entry point into it. So, then, of course, there's the more academic interests where Norse mythology is actually studied for like anthropology, linguistics, philosophy, all that stuff. There's, plenty of groups of people and academic societies that are entirely dedicated to furthering the study and promotion of Scandinavia's ancient culture. Um, and then also, lastly, myths and sagas and other stories, from Norse mythology, were used in ancient societies to convey moral concepts and other thought processes that actually shaped their culture and worldview. So, because of this, Norse mythology is seen as a religious text with, a whole set of derivable beliefs, ritual practices, ethics, and spiritual aspirations. So, as a whole, Norse mythology is kind of all of these things at once, in my opinion. There's a spectrum of people that are interested in it. And it's important to kind of see where people are coming from when they have an interest in Norse mythology, especially how it relates to heathenry and Norse paganism. So, yeah, I figured that was all really good to mention and, get out of the way for a discussion about heathenry specifically.
Yeah, yeah, because I think it's necessary to mention, the Norse mythology before we really figure out what heathenry or Norse paganism is in general. Because that's it's like what you were saying earlier, how it's a kind of a religious text for some people, in that it's not like what the Bible is to the Christians. Mostly because most of the myths written down that we have are written by Christians, not actual pagans.
Yep.
But what we derive from it is basically the social customs, norms, and um, the ethics of the Norse of that day, and we try to
Yes.
reconstruct that framework
Yeah.
um, from that, along with other historical sources. But probably, I would say the myths are probably the biggest one.
Yeah, and there are like other forms of mythology other than Norse, but as you said, Norse mythology is, was happened to be documented in the Christian during the Christianization of Europe, so it's kind of the most well preserved body of myths that we have to reference to. So, um, I think heathenry is just basically Germanic religions, in different localized regions. But Norse mythology just has like a pretty well preserved body of knowledge, even though, like you said, it has a lot of Christian influence in it. So
Right.
there's a
Yeah.
baby in that bathwater.
Yeah. So don't throw it all out.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah. And that's what I will say. Moving on to what is heathenry or Norse paganism? Like I would say, kind of like you said, heathenry is more or less focused on all uh, of Germanic religious focuses, not solely on the Norse, because you'll find as you study various different Germanic tribes like Anglo Saxons and some of the Germanic tribes who had contacts with Romans. Certain religious practices and even names for deities would be different. Like probably the most obvious would be to the Norse, the All Father is Odin, whereas for the Anglo Saxons, his name is Woden. You have little regional differences like that, which
It could be
um,
it could be fun to kind of piece together a broader picture with that. But you're right, there are like distinctions. So
yeah, and I would say, like, if I was gonna say in like a sentence what heathenry is, it's basically a reconstructionist religion with a strong focus on reconstructing, um, you know, the religious and spiritual beliefs of the Germanic peoples as a whole. That's what I would say.
yeah, and yeah, because when Christianity came around, it was kind of a monopoly, right? They showed up and everybody else's religions sort of it's kind of like the McDonald's of religion. That's how I see it. It kind of just spread around and everybody's got one, They've
Yeah.
but then you've got these ethnic restaurants, I've heard it put that way. If you want to kind of get to know the recipes of that indigenous culture, it's probably a good idea to skip McDonald's, right? So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I mean, there's also a huge folklore element with reconstructing religion and trying to understand the points of view of those people. It's just a kind of a normal topic to go about when you're talking about pre-Christian religions is trying to rediscover um, a lot of what was changed or done away with during the Christianization process. So,
Right, because
um, yeah,
that's
folklore is a pretty important part of it.
yeah, and that's part of the reason why it's so we have to say Reconstructionist is yeah, really the only thing that was written down were the myths and even the scarce sources we can find of how our ancestors practiced their religion have to be taken with a pretty big grain of salt because more often than not, the people who were recording this stuff were Christian missionaries or Romans who more often than not were trying to justify military expansions.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you might not be getting the most objective uh, opinions.
Yeah.
And I think that's also why, if you look at various groups, why they may differ a lot in how they practice.
Yeah, and that's a good point because I think they called it interpretatio romana when they would go around and just sort of they would actually like compare gods of different people with their own gods. So of course,
Yeah.
yeah, you're getting a real Romanized version of it.
Well, yeah, because like if you read Tacitus's Germania, like we are assuming he's comparing Odin with Mercury because linguistically they're really connected, but like for like every god he mentioned that the Germans um, uh, worshipped, he would equate to a Roman god, with the exception of Nerthus. Like that was the only exception. And like everything else was Romanized. So it's like, okay, okay. It makes it a little harder to figure out, what the truth is. And I think this part of the reason why sometimes people have to rely on intuitions and get in touch with a more spiritual side, which can be discouraging for someone who's just coming in.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, because all the sources we have to go off of have been interpreted through a different cultural lens. So the burden's put upon us to try to figure out, where they were at and through their cultural lens.
Yeah. And I
And
think,
because they're human beings and they perceive and they digest things the way human beings do, that burden is one that is incorporates our own intuition and our own thoughts, and that's why I get a lot of you know personal fulfillment out of studying the topics.
yeah. So actually, I think this would be a great transition for, our second topic is what brought you to heathenry? So I think probably what would be best would be to describe our religious backgrounds. Um, we were both Christians, and more specifically for me, being born, raised Christian like most Americans, but uh, our grandparents were one was a preacher, one was a Sunday school teacher. So I think it was a little more serious for me growing up. And Christianity was something that I took very seriously. I took Bible stories very seriously. Like I remember I had, this Bible of just like the New Testament that was made for kids. And I remember seeing all the pictures and it's detailing all these, stories of what's going on, and it's something that I took very seriously. That in fact, like when I was 18, I made the choice. Oh, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And I actually gave a sermon at the church I was going to. Because like that's how serious I took it, and it was like my first dive into um, being a preacher. But like the more and more I studied the Bible, specifically like Old Testament stuff, like the more disillusioned I became with it. I'm like, looking at this God of the Bible, I'm like, God, this guy is one vindictive a hole. This perfectly describes a toxic relationship, and
Yeah,
why would I worship a God like this? I don't know. Yeah. So what was a what about you, Mike?
yeah.
Before
There's a lot of similarity there. I mean, yeah, growing up, I was, my father and my mother were. more concerned with the branch of Christianity called Messianic Judaism, which is kind of like this mixture of the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's like all of the stuff in Judaism, but Jesus is your buddy too, kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, there was a lot. It was very strict. There was a lot of um, restrictions. Lots of, there was, we didn't listen to the radio, Christian radio, movies and pop culture was handpicked by our parents, sort of thing.
Mm.
Um, I actually moved to Louisiana when I was about 7 or 8. So, as far as like my siblings that are older than me, they were more entrenched in all of that, just because they had
Right.
had more time to, grow and mature with that as their belief system. Whereas, I more so have faint memories of, practicing Hanukkah and that sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
when I moved to the South, though, the Bible Belt, it was pretty much a regular thing for people to be Baptist. You know, the school of thought where Elvis shaking his hips is almost like the end of society as we know it. And yeah, so I mean, there were like positive things that I took from Christianity as a kid. I very much so worked the concept of God into my psyche, and just thinking there's an omnipresent, omnipotent man in the heavens. You know, in terms of like fate and all events sort of happening for a reason and that sort of thing. I was comforted by the idea of God. Um, it's something to make you feel like you're not as alone in the world. And then going to church and seeing all these other people, the community aspect I feel was something that I was comforted by. But similarly to what you were saying, there's a certain time, coming of age where you start thinking for yourself and you start looking into things. There's a lot of scary stuff in the Old Testament. You see stories about guys offering up incense to Yahweh and he like smites them because he didn't ask them to do it, kind of thing. Um,
Right.
and there's, people can argue about interpretations of the verses and different denominations and printings of the Bible and different translations and versions and but there was a point where I had access to the internet. Anybody can go to Bible Hub and look at verse by verse all the different translations, and there's not a lot of room for in certain passages there.
Yeah.
Specifically, the faith of a Canaanite woman. I think it's Matthew 15. Just things where Jesus wasn't being very nice to a Canaanite lady. I couldn't really wrap my head around it, and I sort of had this conflict of the religion that I had built up for myself.
Right. Wasn't that the part where he was basically calling her lower than a dog?
Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the one. And it kind of, you're right, because I mean, growing up, it's like oh no, Jesus cared about the poor and he cared about the less fortunate. And then there's this story of this woman coming to him with her baby, and she's this baby's ill in some way, might be demon possessed. And yeah, he says, you know, go away, basically. His disciples are like, this woman's basically crying out after us, like, make her go away, And it just seemed kind of like cold and very different from what I intuitively felt Jesus's character would
Same
be
here.
like.
Same
And
here.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. He just said, You know, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a big turning point in my understanding of Christianity. It sort of planted the seed of me wanting to look further into it and find out how aligned I was with the actual faith. Because while my older siblings were much more knowledgeable, I was sort of separated from the strict aspect of religion at a young age, and was, went as an outsider to Southern culture and their interpretation of Christianity. And I always felt as though, what I was, uh, born and raised with in my early life was very different from that. And so I sort of just kind of came up with my own form of Christianity. And I know this is really common for a lot of people
Yeah.
who don't read the Bible, but they go
Especially
to
today.
church. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was a big turning point in me actually reading through the Bible and seeing a lot of decisions and perspectives from God and Jesus that I didn't really agree with in my soul.
Yeah.
And so, it was actually my father um, who brought up Norse paganism to me when I moved back up north. And at that point, I had pretty much already tapped out from, you know, seeing myself as a Christian.
Yeah.
You sort of flowed into this area of like agnostic or deist or whatever label you want to give yourself, where you're like, oh, I'm spiritual, like I'm not an atheist, but you don't really follow the Bible, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I still, like I said, I saw the world in a spiritual way. I was developed to incorporate my spirituality in my daily life and my decisions and my moral character. So I didn't really want to let go of all that and just throw it by the wayside. And so Norse mythology and Norse paganism and heathenry was my way of, you know, finding a way to not feel alone in the world in my spirituality and try to continue that development that I felt comforted me and brought me peace and belonging in the world. So, in a nutshell, that's why I came to become interested in, in Norse paganism.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, it should be noted we're cousins.
Right.
Just so there's
Yes.
no confusion. And yeah, for me, same thing as you. It was your dad who brought me into it, my uncle. And but like I think what's more special um for me is I'm not sure quite what to make it. I don't know if it's our version of divine intervention or, our ancestors calling out to me, but I have for most of my at least conscious life, I've always had a strong interest in Norse mythology, mostly because like when I was a really little kid, my mom used to take me and my brothers to the library and we'd check out books and stuff. And I remember I picked up this book of Norse mythology. I had no idea what it was because I couldn't read yet, but I really liked the pictures. Like I really liked the pictures. And it was specifically a book like written for children. And I remember I would just flip all through all the pages and look at it, and I thought it was so neat, even though I didn't really have any idea what I was looking at. And then fast forward like 3 more years where I'm in the third grade, so now I can actually read. And I found the same book at my school library. And, I read all the stories and I just absolutely loved them. And obviously I was still Christian, but I love the stories for what they were. Kind of like how you were saying earlier, some people look at Norse mythology for pure literary entertainment. At the time, that's kind of how I looked at it.
Yeah.
And yeah, then we just kind of fast forward to the point of my life where I was just seriously questioning Christianity. And at the time, I was also like heavily looking into like history of Vikings and checking that stuff out, getting more into Norse mythology. And I just it just felt like something was kind of pulling me in that direction. And then like what sealed that relationship was, yeah, your uncle like really, or sorry, I misspoke. Your dad, my uncle, uh, uh, explaining it even more, and like that's what did it for me. I was like all in. Let's do this.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. I had when I was a kid, I had a book called Hercules and the Golden Apples.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and it was a picture like made for kids, and yeah, the imagery really stood out to me as well. Um, there's something to be said for the power of mythic image, and just there's um there's a lot of there's a lot that's taught in with Christian attitudes about being meek and humble and having humility and these kinds of things. And there was something that really stood out to me when it came to Greek mythology about heroes and men who strived to or demigods that strive to accomplish something bigger than themselves, and the trials that they went through. And it's just something that people have related to throughout all of time. And some of those images are just very, very potent in terms of their spiritual meaning.
yeah,
And yeah, there's definitely an allure to it as far as being a human on planet Earth. And there's a lot in life that there's a lot of triumph and a lot of experiences that we all share that I feel Christianity doesn't really have a big spiritual framework for. And that's another thing that I always remembered that book. Even learning about Norse mythology all those years later, it's just something that seemed intrinsic to the human experience that I don't feel like it was necessarily kept from me. It just seemed like in Christianized society, people, let's just say, don't really have a way to communicate that outside of um, things that are somewhat against Christian attitudes.
yeah,
So yeah, it was Norse mythology in particular opened up my mind to embracing those kinds of things and not feeling as though you know you gotta reserve glory for God, and having false idols and these heroes, and just kind of goes against a lot of experiences that we all share in life. So,
yeah,
but yeah, as far as our first podcast and everything, I'm really happy that we're able to share our experiences with people. And I think that you know there's a lot of room for exploration, because as you said earlier, a lot of people will go from being a Christian, and they no longer identify with that moniker anymore of being a Christian, and
right,
they'll kind of look at new religious options through the same dogmatic kind of view that Christians have. And
yeah,
there's just it does a disservice to the soul in terms of how much room for exploration there really is. And
yeah,
you know I see it as a success, being able to share that with other people, that there is a lot for us to discover and explore within ourselves.
right, yeah, yeah, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Just let people know, number one, they're not alone, and give other people a something else to look to, because that's what can be especially hard too if you're all by yourself trying to figure this stuff out. It can be extremely discouraging, and it kind of like leaves a spiritual hole inside people, and that's kind of why I'm doing this, is to give something to other people and help them start their own journey, because I don't want to necessarily do it for other people, because I think that's another big aspect of the Norse, is they were rugged individualists and took great pride in um, accomplishing things on their own and not having to rely on somebody else to bring good fortune to them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a good thing to encourage people to nourish their own spiritual growth for sure. Um, I think that there are like you know people out there that would rather you just come back to the church. Um,
Yeah.
if if you come to a point where you have so much cognitive dissonance that you just can't really go back to that, it can leave you feeling quite alone. So while people do need to do it for themselves and find their own way to be spiritually, um, I do think it's important to say no one ever did everything by themselves, even though that is like a very healthy virtue to be individualist. There's
Yeah.
definitely no shame in seeking out a community to discuss these things and
Right.
feel like a sense of belonging to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because like I will say that even though our ancestors were like rugged individualists, that didn't mean at all they were anti-community,
Yes,
especially since human beings in general we're social creatures, we're social animals. We need our tribes, and without them, we can't make it.
I
um,
agree. I agree.
so
Yeah,
yeah.
there's social cohesion super important, and
Yeah.
it's part of what makes societies great.
Mhm.
Is that unifying element, as you and I both know.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
yeah, overall, I'd say this has been pretty productive. I've had a good time. Um, Coming up on the 30-minute mark here, but yeah, I'm sure as we go along and there we'll come up with more topics, and this is just sort of our introductory phase of getting our feet wet with the podcast. But I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we probably try to stick to a weekly schedule for an episode, focusing on certain topics. But yeah, like you said, we're just getting our feet wet, getting some introductory stuff out of the way, so we can start talking about other stuff.
Yeah, and I don't want. I do like the academic perspective of Norse mythology. There's been a lot of work put into figuring all of it out and um, sort of postulating different, ways of looking at it. But yeah, there might be some topics we cover that get into that kind of stuff. I mean, naturally, the discussion might go in that direction. We might have topics where, episodes where we go over topics that are kind of contested, but I really don't think, the aim of this podcast, we've talked about it in private, is to sort of just get into some mud flinging argument about it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I think that's a problem with most religious or spiritual movements is this sort of idea that we have to prove each other wrong, and where you know our spiritual experiences are valid in ways that many people aren't going to understand. But yeah, there is definitely something for us, a common ground for people to meet and discuss with. So with newer episodes, I'm sure it's going to mostly be focusing on self exploration and integrating these topics into the way we approach our lives and build a more healthy life, more so than just arguing about what some person said about something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, this guy said this stuff. He's wrong.
Right on. Well,
Yeah.
then, yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed it. Had a nice time talking about all this stuff, and it feels good getting back into the groove of exploring this topic with other people. I'm sure a lot of people who um, embark on a spiritual journey away from Christianity um, have sort of felt like they're going to the woodshed and trying to hash out ideas on their own. So hopefully, this podcast can serve as a benefit to people who are trying to go on their spiritual journey um, with company.
Yep, indeed.
Indeed. All right. So until next time.